Welcome to Whiteboard Learning. Today's episode is about the insulin CRI, and just want to explain why we do that instead of giving intermittent injections. So you remember what insulin does is that it drives sugar that is traveling along or glucose, sugar driving along the bloodstream, and it wants to get inside the cell. And so insulin drives the sugar into the cell by creating more receptors for sugar transport on the surface of the cell. So we want to do that for diabetics, and we sometimes do it for hyperkalemics because it also can drive potassium in. So the insulin CRI, it tries to do what the intermittent does, injections, but on a little bit more static basis, so a steady basis. So here's your sugar, and here is the blood sugar, BG, blood glucose. And normal is about here to about here, 80 to a 120, right? So a diabetic is usually up at about 300. Now, if my blood sugar is 300 and I give an injection of injection of insulin, that will drive the sugar down over time. And I don't know how low it'll go. It might go very low, it might go not low, it might go too low. So it's sort of a variable effect depending on how much the patient ate to counteract that drop. So an intermittent injection is a little bit unpredictable. And so when we do a CRI, what we try to do with the patient's sugar is start here and make our way down to sort of an acceptable range and stay in there by providing variable amounts of insulin. So let's say it's starting to come up a little bit. We might increase the amount of insulin we're giving, and then we would see it drop down. And so we're seeing it kind of go like this. And we try to, number one, not drop the sugar more than about 50 milligrams per deciliter per hour, because that can cause osmotic changes that could be bad for the brain. So this gives us a lot of frequent monitoring of the blood sugar. We're checking it about every 1 to 2 hours, most of the time on an insulin CRI. So that constant drip of insulin slowly, hopefully slowly, brings us down and tries to keep us in that range instead of, as for intermittent, dropping it down, bringing it up, dropping it down, bringing it up, and not being able to find a steady state. And usually the steady state helps you get rid of ketones a little bit more reliably. So this is a little bit more about the technical aspects of the insulin CRI. So first of all, what insulin do we use? Well, we're not using the long-acting insulins like the Lantus and the NPH and the Prozinc, etc. We are only using the regular insulin, and that is because it doesn't have any additives in it. So you want to make sure that you use regular, and that may also be listed as R on the box and on the bottle. Humulin just means it's human. So that is regular insulin. That is pure insulin, human insulin. It doesn't have any preservatives, additives, anything added to it to make it last longer. So it is considered a short-acting insulin. So if you turned off an insulin CRI, it would very quickly, the sugar would rise back up again. And luckily, you can turn it off, unlike intermittent, where once you've given it, that's it, you've given it. So we want to use regular. Now, one of the problems with insulin is that it binds to plastic. So all of our lines and catheters are plastic. So in the protocol, the first thing we talk about is adding insulin to a bag of saline, 0.9% saline. Now, you could add it to a different 0.45%. I don't think that would be a problem, but usually we're using it at 0.9%. And you add insulin to the bag, whatever amount, and we'll talk about in a second. You let it mix, and then you're going to run it through your line or your burette. If it's a small patient, you're going to run it through the line to coat all of the plastic with some insulin. And in a kind of theory, we just say it's about 50 mils to run through the system. So you waste 50 mils of your 250 bag. Now, generally, what has been protocol, and we all just do it mainly because we want to speak the same language when we go from place to place to place, and not everybody's doing it differently. But you're generally adding to a 250 mil bag. Now, if you had a giant patient, you don't have to do it that way. If you run it at a certain rate, you can do it wherever you want. But generally, the protocols start this way. And they start usually, if you look a protocol up, it'll be 2.2 units per kilo of regular insulin to a 250 mil bag that is actually 10 mils taken out, so it's 240. And the reason they do that arbitrarily is so that you can make 24 hours of a solution, but you're not really, because you're taking out 50 mils. So don't worry about it, but that's the protocol, so that we always do it the same way. Now, isn't that an odd number, right? 2.2 units per kilo, that's really 1 unit per pound. So, I know we do 2.2 and we get real fixated on that, but it's 1 unit per pound. Now, the dose of insulin that we choose, as I just said, could be 2.2 units per kilo into the stock bag. So here's our stock bag. So it could be 2.2 units per kilo. But sometimes you have a patient who is very insulin resistant and you want to double the concentration. So some people will up it to 4.4 units per kilo. And that is totally up to you how you want to do that. If you want to give more insulin and you have a bag that's already made up and you don't want to waste it, either you have to increase the rate that you give it, or you have to add more insulin to the bag. So there's only 2 ways to give more insulin that way. So let's say we decide we have a medium-sized dog and we're going to do 2.2 units per kilo of regular in the bag, and then we're going to run it to our patient. Now, generally, there's a little bit of disagreement on how to decide how much to give. But remember what your objective is here, right? You're trying to bring it down and then find steady state. You don't want to go too low and you don't want to stay high. So you want to find that sort of middle ground. So all of the charts that we have basically are the rate of the insulin. Okay, I wrote that kind of badly. Say the rate of the insulin, and then what the sugar is, so that you can say rate of insulin. And let's just arbitrarily say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. Like those could be your rates. And the BG, well, you want the higher amount if it's too high. You want a medium amount if it's kind of in a good range. And you want 0 if it's too low. So all of these protocols that we have are basically variations of this theme. Now, one of the standard ones that we have generally starts at 10 mils an hour as a good starting place. When you're starting out with your patient, you're going to have all of them start at 10 mils per hour. So some people say that's a max rate. That's not a max rate. There is no max rate. There's a max rate for your patient. So if your patient is 1 kilogram, 10 mils an hour is a lot. But there is no max rate, and that's something that people have to understand. The only limiting factor is how fast the sugar is dropping. But if the sugar isn't dropping, you're getting a lot of resistance, insulin resistance, then you can go higher. But generally, let's talk about what we usually do. So we usually say some range, like greater than 300. We're going to run the insulin at 10 mils an hour at a nice starting rate. And then if it's somewhere between 200 and 300, we're going to drop the rate. Maybe it'll be 8. And then if it's 100, now we're starting to get into normal range, then maybe we only want like 2. So these are made up numbers. We're going to look on our CRI. Now, right around here, we're starting to get a little worried, right? What if we don't check it quick enough and this patient actually gets too low and has a seizure? So a lot of times we start to do things like add. And so here we'll add dextrose. And it might be 2.5% or it might be 5%. Now, if it's less than 100 or less than 80, some say no insulin at all, and you definitely want to be on dextrose to make sure you don't drop any lower. So let's talk about that. So once we get to that below 60 range, see if this is 100, and our sugar's dropping, we get down there, that's the problem with insulin CRI, is that, and any insulin, is that you get into that hypoglycemic range, and you could have seizures, ataxia, vomiting, weakness, all of those things. The problem, particularly with a CRI, is what happens here, where you have a pump, or you have here a human who helps run this line, right? So either an error in this pump and in the line itself, or in this human, could lead to a bolus of insulin and a sudden slam drop in the insulin and bad clinical signs. So that's something to be very, very careful about. These are never bolused and should never be opened with your clamp, with your little rolly ball clamp here. That's a terrible picture of a rolly ball clamp. Should never be opened up to go into the patient. A lot of care has to be taken with these insulin CRIs, that they don't bolus in the patient. The other part is this part, time. So if too much time goes by on a high rate, you could drive the patient into hypoglycemia. So one important thing is to set a timer so that you make sure you always go and get your sugars on time. And then the other thing that can happen, unfortunately, is if you drop it too slowly, as we discussed, too quickly. If you drop the sugars too quickly, you change the osmolarity of the blood and you shift water into the cells, and you can make some problems with the osmolarity of the brain. So that could be bad too. So I hope that helps and doesn't confuse you too much. And if you have any questions, just let me know.